Ever feel like you're carrying around a secret? One so big it kind of shapes your whole life,
Hmm.
you know? For many Dalits, that secret, yes, their caste.
Hmm.
Today, we're diving into Yashica Dutt's memoir, NUW, coming out as Dalit, to really try to understand this experience.
Yeah, it's such a powerful exploration of something, honestly, that we just don't hear enough about. These deeply personal costs of a system that's often presented in these like purely systemic terms.
Exactly. And Dutt, she doesn't shy away from the tough questions at all. Reservation, identity, how caste plays out, even in the diaspora.
Right.
But she starts, her journey by taking us back to her childhood.
Hmm.
And what I found really interesting is, like, she didn't even know her own caste growing up, yet she understood it was something to be deeply ashamed of.
Wow.
How does that even happen?
That's the insidious nature of this prejudice, isn't it? It's everywhere, it permeates everything, even before, like you can even really put a name to it. Like she says, it's in the very air you breathe.
And it's reinforced through language.
Right, absolutely.
Dutt talks about how hearing slurs like bongi, even without really understanding, like, their full weight as a child, made her feel this intense sense of shame.
It's amazing how language can be such a powerful weapon, you know what I mean?
Really?
Like just dehumanizing entire groups of people with a word and just perpetuating these power structures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And for Dutt, it wasn't just the slurs. There's this, like, really heartbreaking story she tells about buying flour as a kid.
Okay.
Her family was struggling financially, but her mother made her lie to the shopkeeper, saying they were baking a cake.
Wow.
Think about that for a moment. Just maintaining that facade.
Yeah.
Like that appearance of being upper caste, even when it means hiding your own struggles.
Right.
It reveals just how deeply ingrained that this fear of being found out truly is.
Yeah, and like how exhausting that must be.
Totally. It's like their entire life was a performance, with the constant threat of exposure looming over them.
Right.
Dutt even compares this experience to African Americans passing as white.
Yeah, that comparison really highlights the emotional toll of living under such a system, doesn't it? Now, she is careful to point out, like, it's not a perfect parallel, right?
Right.
The historical context is different. Caste operates in its own, like, unique way within Indian society in India and the diaspora. But that feeling of hiding a fundamental part of yourself, that resonates, right?
It makes you wonder, if this is the weight of the secret, what are the supposed solutions? One common narrative, especially for marginalized communities, is that education is the great equalizer.
Right.
Dutt's mother firmly believed this and made huge sacrifices to send her to a prestigious boarding school. What happens when even education isn't enough to outrun these deeply ingrained societal structures?
Yeah, that's the heart of Dutt's story, isn't it? Because she does succeed academically, like graduates top of her class, but that deep sense of not belonging never really goes away.
She's constantly having to prove herself in a way her upper caste peers simply don't. Like, she talks about struggling with college entrance exams and feeling this immense pressure as if she's carrying the weight of her entire community on her shoulders.
And tragically, this is where Rohit Vemula's story, which Dutt brings into her own narrative, becomes so relevant.
Yeah, and for those who may not know, Vemula was a Dalit scholar at Hyderabad Central University who tragically took his own life in 2016. His death sparked nationwide protests against caste discrimination in education.
His story really highlights the systemic barriers that persist even within spaces that are, like, meant to be about opportunity and advancement. Like, here was a brilliant young man facing immense discrimination from the university administration, denied access to resources. He ultimately felt like he had nowhere to turn.
It's as if the system itself was crushing him.
Exactly, yeah.
And Dutt draws a direct parallel between Vemula's experiences and her own, particularly when she gets into St. Stephen's College, one of India's most elite institutions. The irony isn't lost on her. She's achieved this, like, incredible feat, yet that feeling of being an outsider, of not truly belonging, never really leaves her.
Which ultimately exposes the limitations of viewing education as, like, a simple solution to such a deeply ingrained societal problem.
Right.
It can be a pathway, for sure, but the obstacles are so much greater, and the pressure to succeed that much heavier for students from marginalized backgrounds. It's not just about, like, providing access. It's about dismantling the systemic barriers that persist even within these spaces. And that leads us, I think, naturally to one of the most contentious debates surrounding caste, the reservation system.
Yeah, and Dutt really grapples with this throughout the book. Like,
Yeah.
you can tell she's really wrestling with all sides of just like a really complex issue.
Right.
For those maybe who aren't as familiar, could you give us a quick breakdown? What is reservation and what's the purpose?
Yeah, so in essence, it's a form of affirmative action in India.
Okay.
A certain percentage of seats in educational institutions and even positions in government jobs are reserved for historically marginalized communities, including Dalits.
With the goal being to kind of level the playing field after, centuries of systemic exclusion.
Exactly. It's about trying to create opportunities for communities who've been systematically denied access for generations.
Right.
Of course, this sparks a lot of debate.
Yeah.
Arguments for and against the system.
And Dutt acknowledges those complexities.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, she doesn't shy away from the arguments on either side at all, but she also pushes us, I think, towards a more, nuanced understanding.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
She challenges the way the reservation debate is often framed, particularly by those who, oppose it.
Right.
They make it seem like a zero-sum game,
Yeah.
where if one group benefits, another group automatically loses out.
And Dutt pushes back against this kind of limited framework.
Yes, absolutely. One of her, I think, most compelling points is that this debate often fixates solely on government jobs and institutions, as if they're the only avenues for opportunity.
Yeah.
But in India today, the private sector plays an even bigger role.
And that's where things, I think, get really interesting.
Exactly.
Wow.
It complicates the argument that reservation creates an uneven playing field. Because if the goal is equality of opportunity,
Right.
shouldn't that apply across all sectors, not just those controlled by the government?
Dutt takes this even further, arguing that even in places like Silicon Valley,
Right.
often touted as this pinnacle of meritocracy,
Right.
caste still has an influence.
And there's research to support that.
Yeah.
Dutt highlights a study where researchers send out identical job applications, the only difference being the names,
Okay.
which were clearly identifiable as either upper or lower caste.
And the results were pretty shocking, right?
They were.
Yeah.
The study found that those with upper caste names were significantly more likely to get called for an interview, even though their qualifications were identical, like on paper.
So even when you remove those kind of overt markers of caste, the bias still seeps through.
It really highlights how these biases run deep, often operating on an unconscious level, even in environments that pride themselves on being meritocratic. Which brings us to another important aspect of Dutt's book.
Yeah.
The way she connects caste to the experiences of the diaspora, particularly Indian Americans.
It's almost like this unspoken baggage that follows people across continents, even when they're trying to build these new lives.
Right.
You can't escape who you are and where you come from, even when you cross borders.
Dutt challenges this idea that you can just leave caste behind when you immigrate.
Right.
She talks about the model minority myth, often applied to Indian Americans, and how it masks the internal hierarchies that exist within the community.
It's a label that seems positive on the surface, but can actually be incredibly damaging.
Exactly.
Right.
It sets up this unrealistic expectation and ignores the struggles of those who don't fit that narrow stereotype, including those facing caste-based discrimination.
And it's not just about representation. It's
Right.
also about concrete instances of discrimination, like the Sisto case.
Right. That case really brought the issue of caste and the diaspora to the forefront.
Yeah.
A Dalit engineer sued Cisco, a major tech company, for caste-based discrimination he faced from colleagues.
Wow.
It made headlines, forcing people to confront the reality that caste doesn't simply disappear when people immigrate.
Right.
Dutt argues that this goes all the way back to how early Indian immigrants, primarily from upper castes, positioned themselves when they first arrived in the U.S. They wanted to be seen as distinct from other marginalized groups, creating this distance, this artificial hierarchy that has unfortunately persisted in many ways.
And Dutt, along with other Dalit activists, have faced significant pushback for even trying to bring this issue to light, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. It's almost as if acknowledging that caste exists, even in these spaces, is deeply uncomfortable for some.
There's a real resistance to even having these conversations, which of course, makes it that much harder to address the problem.
As we've been talking about all this, a story Dutt tells toward the end of the book keeps coming back to me.
Okay.
It's about the Pawonker brothers,
Yeah.
Dalit cricket players in the early 20th century.
Right.
Have you heard of them?
Yeah, I mean, their story is one of those that really stays with you, you know?
Absolutely.
It's both inspiring and incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
Just a perfect illustration of kind of these complexities Dutt is grappling with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were incredibly talented athletes.
Oh, yeah.
Clearly recognized for their skill, but they just like kept hitting up against those invisible barriers.
It perfectly encapsulates that, like, allowed to play,
Yep.
but not truly accepted experience that so many Dalits have described throughout history and even today.
Right, and like Baloo, the eldest brother, was this phenomenal bowler.
Right.
So good that the Hindu team like recruited him.
Wow.
They needed his talent,
Right.
but they refused to make him captain, even though he was the most experienced player.
It's a classic example of how caste functions.
Right.
Like, people in power, they're happy to benefit from your skills, your labor, your talent,
Right.
but that doesn't mean they're willing to grant you true equality, true leadership.
Right. And Dutt connects this directly to, her own experiences in journalism.
A field that even today still struggles, honestly, with amplifying Dalit voices.
She talks about how hard it is to even break into these spaces,
Yeah.
to have your work taken seriously as more than just like a Dalit perspective,
Right.
as though that somehow like lessens its value or its universality.
It's that constant pressure to be exceptional, to like go above and beyond just to be seen as equal.
Right.
That like resonates so strongly with her experience,
Yeah.
And it's a stark reminder that progress isn't linear. We can celebrate, individual achievements while still acknowledging that systemic barriers still very much exist.
So where does that kind of leave us?
Yeah.
What are some of the key takeaways, do you think, that we can glean from Dutt's story, from her journey?
I think she challenges us to really examine our own assumptions about success, about merit, about what it means to truly belong,
Yeah.
Who gets to define those things?
Right.
Whose stories are we prioritizing and whose are we overlooking?
It's about recognizing that these invisible hierarchies exist in all sorts of spaces.
Absolutely.
Even those that, claim to be like purely meritocratic.
Yeah, and asking ourselves some tough questions, right? Like,
Right.
are we creating environments where everyone has a genuine opportunity to thrive? Or are we even unintentionally perpetuating systems of exclusion?
Dutt's memoir is such a powerful reminder that the fight for equality is far from over. It requires constant vigilance, critical self-reflection, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. Her story, while deeply personal, carries a message that resonates far beyond her individual experience. It's a call for all of us to do better, to be more inclusive, and to dismantle those invisible barriers wherever we encounter them.